So I'll just let my eyes adjust for a second. It's lovely to see everybody here. It's an absolute privilege to be here speaking with our wonderful guests today. I'd like to first acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands we're meeting and on whose lands I live when I'm here in Melbourne. My name's Tristan Kennedy. I'm Balladong Noongar. I'm a Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous at Monash University. And like I said, it's an absolute pleasure to be standing here on stage with these wonderful four presenters in Professor Marcia Langton, AO, Brianna Manuel, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, and Professor Helen Evans, AO. To live well together, we need to build cohesive societies, to overcome inequities, to live sustainably within the natural world. We must address the cycles of injustice and displacement borne by Indigenous communities. Indigenous wisdom, leadership, and expertise not only can but must play a critical role in improving health for all and for our planet. So welcome to this plenary session on day 2 of the World Health Summit in Naarm, Melbourne. During this session, we're going to hear from Indigenous scholars and health system leaders. In this session, we will consider the indicators for equity, well-being, and social determinants of health that affect us all. And we'll reflect on how the global health community can respond and partner to build thriving, equitable, and healthy communities. Now, you didn't all come here to hear from me, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of this session. Professor Marcia Langton, AO, is an anthropologist and geographer, and since 2000 has held the Foundation Chair of Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. She has produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, and Indigenous culture and art. Her role in the Empowered Communities Project, under contract to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and as a member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, are evidence of Professor Langton's academic reputation, policy, commitment and impact, alongside her role as a prominent public intellectual. Professor Langton is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a Fellow of Trinity College, Melbourne, and an Honorary Fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Queensland. In 2016, Professor Langton was honoured as a University of Melbourne Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor. In further recognition, as one of Australia's most respected Indigenous academics, Professor Langton was appointed as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marcia Langton.
Thank you, Tristan. And I acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders. Is my PowerPoint up? What I want to say to you today is an update on how we can live together well, given the circumstances that Indigenous people in Australia find themselves, especially with respect to, how do I move this? Tristan, how do I move it? Is that for moving it? Yeah. You can't be what you can't see. How do we inspire the people we work for to live healthy lives when they live in poverty, a desperate lack of housing, and across-the-board inequities against most health and social indicators? How do we showcase those communities and populations who have risen above poverty and inequity to maintain healthy lifestyles, their cultures and country? These are urgent questions, given the shocking health statistics of the Indigenous population of Australia. self-determination rights and health research are terms that should guide our work. Most of my work in recent times has been in relation to Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, domestic and family violence, and alcohol management. And I've learnt that we must co-design our research with the people we work for to develop tools for building thriving communities. We need Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance to develop our own priorities. I don't need to tell most of the Australian health researchers here about the closing the gap statistics and the lack of progress on 46 closing the gap targets, with progress slow or even getting worse in critical areas. So, except for some education-related targets, the status is below the target trajectory proportions for outcome areas 4, 5, 6 and 7. Only outcome 3 is on target. Improving education outcomes depends largely on improving health outcomes. Our artists have some answers: family, community, country, self-esteem, a vision of our past and our future. Archie Moore, a few days ago, won the Golden Lion Award at the Venice Biennale. And I can't show you his wonderful work because I don't know how to work this. What a shame. But I can show you some pictures from Naomi Hobson's work. Naomi is a wonderful artist from a tiny community in Cape York. She lives on the banks of the Cowan River, where her grandparents were born, and she's deeply immersed in her culture and traditions. She wants to depict the young people in her community in all their beauty and glory, because she believes that her community is happy and healthy. Of course it has its problems, and I think these images show her vision for the future of her community. Please have a look at Archie Moore's work. It's all over the media. It's called Kith and Kin, and it's a genealogy with accompanying documents going back 65,000 years, in which he shows how we are all related to each other. Not just we Aboriginal people descended from the people who came here 65,000 years ago, but all humanity. So they represent our vision that the majority of Australians rejected last October. We wanted a constitutionally enshrined voice so that we could exercise our right of self-determination to build thriving communities with happy, healthy residents. 60% of Australian voters voted no in the referendum on the voice as constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. I refer you to the work of Professor Kath Chamberlain, Ian Anderson, Bronwyn Fredericks, Tom Kalman and Sandra Eads, my colleagues in the British Journal of Medicine, in which they explain that a constitutional voice would have increased autonomy, allow us to have more say over our affairs, access to health services and improve outcomes. The Indigenous leadership in the health sector especially, but in other sectors as well, exercised leadership and self-determination, resulting in an extraordinarily successful response. A constitutional voice would have increased political stability for the long-term strategies needed to tackle health equity. The referendum was a battleground in which racism surged in Australia, And again, Ian Anderson, Ian Paradis, myself, Ray Lovett and Tom Calmer have written about this in The Lancet. We saw incidents of racism soar to the extent that the government provided funding for counselling for the victims of racism. And now we see post-referendum that racism has been normalised and shocking incidents no longer attract the opprobrium they deserve. Let's just look at one of the closing the gap indicators, reducing child mortality rates. I don't need to tell you that the blue bars are Indigenous children and the orange bars are non-Indigenous children. So you can see that across the jurisdictions, from the left, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is the worst for child mortality rates. And the reduction in those rates is going far too slowly. And the issues are complex and have a great deal to do with perinatal health, as our Indigenous professors of health can tell you. Here's an example of the kind of racism that we have to put up with. There's an inquiry into the Northern Territory Police where the juvenile detention centres house 100% Aboriginal kids. This was sent around by one of their task forces. It's called Black Monopoly, and every square says go to jail. And given our incarceration rates, something like 22 times that for other Australians, and the continuing deaths in custody, I think we can see what the issue is. And this came out as a result, this was revealed as a result of an inquiry into racism after evidence from Constable Rolfe, who shot a 9-year-old Warlpiri boy in the back, sitting on his back 3 times. He was, of course, exonerated. So this task force also has a Coon of the Year award. And here's the award handed to the winning Officer of the Year. And of course, the Northern Territory Police have gone from saying there's no racism to, oh, this is disturbing. And the North Australian Justice Agency, the Aboriginal Legal Service that covers the Northern Territory, has pointed, obviously, to the issue of trust. How can people have trust and confidence in a police force that is blatantly racist? However, Indigenous leadership has done a magnificent job during the COVID-19 pandemic. With my colleagues, Professors Fiona Stanley, Sandra Eads, James Ward and others, we noted that our Indigenous health workforce and leaders recognised first that all colonised Indigenous populations internationally are at very high risk from pandemics such as COVID. They are more likely to have chronic disease, live in overcrowded housing, have limited understanding of viral infections, and there are other issues, of course. We expected very high infection rates, especially following the disastrous impact of H1N1 influenza. We expected very high hospitalisation and death rates from COVID. However, because the Indigenous leadership responded early, long before governments, closed their own borders, set up communication strategies, and mobilised their workforce, in the first year of the pandemic we had no deaths at all. And following that, the death rates were very, very low. And the leadership participated in all of the state and federal COVID task forces and showed that having a voice in health works to improve health. One of the enormous issues for our population is historical trauma. This is a diagram devised by Professor Yin Paradis. I refer you to it. It's entitled Transgenerational Transmission of Historical Trauma from Kermeyer. So we believe that historical trauma is exacerbated by racism, by ongoing inequities, and that we must address racism as well as the social determinants of health. But most of all, the Indigenous voice, leadership and participation is urgent to improve health. Decolonising and localising international development efforts, the goals of movements across the world for disadvantaged communities, and we need principles of justice, equity based on needs, local perspectives and preferences of those countries and communities, not on those of actors in high-income countries and communities. So that's from the international literature, and we know that First Nations Australians have been calling for this for a very long time, especially in the realm of health. And it's not surprising that most development initiatives have direct and indirect links to health. So after Australia's no vote, where do we stand in improving Indigenous health? Again, my colleagues writing in the British Journal of Medicine note that the government must establish a legislative body to ensure regional community representation. It must commit to funding for our leadership to plan and implement long-term strategies to end wraparound services for families and access to disability support services. 1 in 4 of our people live with a disability. Australia must also implement the recommendations of royal commissions, including those related to deaths in custody, removal of children from families, forced removal of children from families, which continues, and importantly, women and children's safety. And later today, you'll have access to the article I contributed to the publication for this conference. The government must support the Australian Human Rights Commission to establish a reconciliation body, the Makarrata Commission, and an anti-racism framework. Our National Health Plan guides closing the gap and includes the goal of eliminating racism as an enabler. Racism and hate speech proliferated in the referendum campaign, and hence we must invest in anti-racism, pro-inclusivity strategies across society, including in schools, healthcare and other workplaces, recognising intersectionality and other forms of discrimination, such as gender and disability. In summary, our survival depends on our right to self-determination. We ask the Australian government to meet its international obligations, the minimum standards to ensure the rights, dignity and survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Langton, for that wonderful presentation and the commentary on some of the failings that we've seen in this country, and I'm sure are mirrored in Indigenous communities around the world. And I think, given the context of this particular summit, it's important that we remind ourselves of those challenges that still remain. Thank you so much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rihanna Manuel. Rihanna is Te Aka Matua Chief Executive of Te Aka Whai Ora Maori Health Authority. Rihanna is a skilled, strategic and visionary leader within the Maori and health sectors with extensive experience leading kaupapa Maori organisations. Rihanna is a registered nurse practitioner who has based her career in community and Maori healthcare. Prior to her appointment as Chief Executive for Te Aka Whai Ora, Rihanna was Nurse Director at Waikato District Health Board, Chief Executive of Hauraki Primary Health Organisation, and rural iwi-based health provider Te Korowai Hoora o Hauraki. Rihanna's aim has always been to ensure people in both rural and urban areas have services appropriate to their communities, rather than applying a universal approach to healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Rihanna Manuel.
Ko tā whakinuia he mai, ko ia te kaipai here ngā iwi e. Ki te raumatauranga, ko ngā ke te wānanga tuoi oi nuku, tuoi oi rangi, kua hau ko te aka whai ora. Kua hau ko te aka whai ora. Tēnā rā koutou e ngā rauranga tirama. Tuatahi, ka tuku atu tēnei mihi ki te whenua taurikura e noho nei. Ki ngā tangata whenua e whakatau i a mātou ki roto i tēnei whenua e mihi atu ana kia koutou. Ki ngā kaimahi i roto i tēnei āhuatanga e mihi atu ana kia koutou mō tō tūwhiratanga o tēnei wānanga. Kia koutou katoa e noho ana ki rungi i te tūru, ki te whakarongo, ki te ariari, ki taku kōrero, e mihi atu ana kia koutou. Ki ngā kai kōrero i te rangi nei, e mihi atu ana kia koutou, mō tō mahi, mō tō kaha, mō tō whawhai i roto i tēnei kaupapa o te hauora. Tēnā rā koutou katoa. Don't worry, folks, I always translate. And I know a few of you were starting to wonder, is she going to flip back into Te Reo Pākehā, or otherwise known as English? And yes, she is. First of all and foremostly, I want to pay tribute to this land, to the elders of this land, and to the people who give us the privilege of being here today to both hui, or to be together, have these discussions and these kaupapa without the whenua or the land, without the consent of the founding people of this whenua, we would not be here. And so I pay a special tribute to our haukainga, we call them at home, or the tangata whenua, or the people of this land, nei ngā mihi. Rihanna Manuel is my name, and I come from a small little town in the big country, metropolis of Aotearoa. The town that I was raised in, or the village I was raised in, is called Manaia. It's marked by our traditional markings of our maunga, te aroha on one side, and moihau on the other. Maunga are another word for mountains, so we use our land or our whenua markings to mark the boundaries of our community. And circled around my whenua is the ocean of Tikapa Moana, and right in the middle of this ocean is the land that I belong to, which is Hauraki. I come from 3 specific tribes, Ngāti Pūkenga, Ngāti Maru, and Ngāti Kahungunu, all of whom have been a contributor to the uprising, to the raising, and to the deliberate growing of my life. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I am so proud to stand here today, and yes, I was the Te Aka Matua, or the CEO for Te Aka Whai Ora, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our journey, and I'm going to also tell you about, whilst we look in the rear view mirror and talk about what's been, I'm going to also talk about what's ahead of us. So we'll get straight into it. Can I have, oh, that's right, we've got the little, okay, here we go. The first thing I want you to do is to understand that we as Māori are storytellers. Our language was not written for most of our years. It is a very new construct to have a written language, which we now do have. But before we had a written language, most of our language could be found in the songs, the stories, and the traditional carvings and or drawings that you would find throughout our country. I want to introduce you to Kingi Tāwhiao. This gentleman has been an important person for me as a uri, or a person who comes from the Tainui waka. King Tawhiao was the second Māori king in our country. And one of the things he was exquisite at was developing up what we call proverbs in Te Reo Pākehā, or the English language, but in our language they were called tongikura. And one of the tongikura that we have adopted since the arrival of Te Aka Whaiora has been e kore tēnei whakaoranga e huri ki tua o aku mokopuna. It is the determination that our grandchildren will inherit a better place than we did. It should be one of the founding principles of every conversation, of every decision, of every paper, of every policy, of every strategy that we in health write. If you are not thinking about the generations that are coming after us, then you are not thinking about good health, thriving, or well-being in your community. And I know that's a really challenging statement, but it simply is the truth. For most of us, the changes and decisions we make now will have very little bearing on the outcome, but they will have a massive impact on the lives of these children. And so we have to get really energised and really invigorated about it. And this king knew that. He absolutely knew it. And at the time he uttered this particular tongikura, it was a time when he had been in hiding from the militia of the time, the constabulary, who were hunting him down because they wanted his lands, they wanted him to cede his sovereignty. And on his return, he came back into his lands to see his people decimated. Almost all of his land was confiscated. And he uttered this particular tongikura. How fitting is it that in this day and age, and having just listened to our previous speaker, Kōrero, the story is still playing out. The need for us to be ever more intent about our determination towards inheriting a better place is more important than ever. Our journey began with inequities, and every Indigenous culture will have the same story. I feel like I'm going to be repeating some of the slides you've already seen, so I am going to make sure that I try not to do that. But you get the picture. Inequities are what drive the system. And of course, we know that equity isn't just about an Indigenous cultural thing. It is about all the other groups or cultures who also are struck down by the inequities of any kind of system. And unfortunately, when we're designing these systems, we probably don't think enough about this. I know that we all think that we know what equity is, and we know that what an inequity looks like, but so seldom do we write the national policies that then turn into operations on the ground that govern that thinking. For Te Aka Whaiora, the journey also began with the Y2575 recommendation. The Waitangi Tribunal is kind of the national body or the legal body in New Zealand who will look at any kind of claim that is put forward by Māori. And for the Y2575 claim, this was the understanding that we should explore the possibility of a Māori health authority. And it goes back to the commentary of our previous speaker. It is about self-determination. It's the logic that if what we've been doing for the last how many decades is not working, then probably we need to try something else. And one of the things we should try is to enable self-determination of our Indigenous people. We should agree upon a methodology which could be used to quantify the extent of the underfunding of Māori health services in the primary care area. And of course, review and redesign the current partnership arrangements, bringing Te Tiriti to the fold. We understood that we needed innovative leadership, and that was a responsibility for all of us, not just for an agency. Innovative leadership means that we all take responsibility. We must all lead forward with this. And for a moment in time in Aotearoa, we decided that we were going to try something that was more partnerful, that was more about self-determination, and so we saw the rising up of Te Aka Whaiora. And so I bring my chair, Tepa Mahuta, into the room with me, because we can't always be together in spaces and places, but I want to acknowledge the board that have governed Te Aka Whaiora, and this wahine, Te Pairu, who is just been a taituara for our kaupapa. But what she also is about is the deep and understanding partnerships and how they can be partnerful. because partnerships are often premised on the description or the definition of what partnership looks like. We seldom get into what does a partnerful partnership look like. What will it mean if we truly give over something? Because let's be honest, co-design and giving rise to self-determination means giving up something from the mainstream system. It means divesting the investment that comes into health into Māori-specific innovations. And sometimes that can feel and look like things that we are a little bit afraid of. So we've seen the rise up of more rongoa providers. Rongoa is like the traditional Māori healing kaupapa within Aotearoa. We've seen many more providers come into place since Te Aka Whairo has been there. And of course, that can make people, particularly when you are well bound to a Western medical system, it can make us feel uncomfortable, and it can make it feel like the land or the sands are shifting beneath our feet. But reforms and relationships go hand in hand. And so the Paiora reform has sought to basically bring this idea of partnership to the front. It has sought to really address the anomalies of te tiriti o Waitangi within the health system. It said that Te Whatuora, or Health New Zealand, that the Ministry of Health and Te Aka Whairo would work hand in hand, but not just on our own, that we would bring iwi Māori partnership boards into the play, and that we would make sure our hauora Māori partners and our whānau and iwi are brought right into this conversation. And that's a tough thing to do, because it can get we have many iwi, and at the moment the Paiora legislation allows for 15 and soon to be 17 iwi Māori partnership boards. So I wanted to kind of introduce you, I know that's a really big picture, but this describes for you what our iwi Māori partnership boards will look like across Aotearoa. And I really want to make reference to this group because after the recent changes to the legislation which has seen the disestablishment of Te Aka Whairo, my heart feels slightly quieter for the fact that our iwi Māori partnership boards will be there. They have not been written out of the legislation. In fact, our current government uses the kōrero often about delivering closer to the hapu, which is a sub-tribe, closer to iwi. These are the groups that will deliver upon that dream. And these are the groups that we've had the absolute privilege of establishing over the last 2 years. And it's really heartwarming to know that there will be this particular lever left in the system. And levers in the system are so important because otherwise we just kind of carry on droning out the same old information, the same old systems, the same strategies and policies, and we can't afford to do that. So here in Aotearoa you can see of the 15 that are scattered across the whenua, you will note that in the South Island, the bottom island, we call that Te Waka o Maui, or Te Taitonga. This is the area where you have 2 iwi Māori partnership boards. In the North Island, which is Te Ika o Maui, or the Fish of Maui, then you have 13 in total currently, with 2 more to come on board. It is important that we really lock these iwi Māori partnership boards into the system so that we can continue to hold the system accountable, both in a monitoring context, and that's monitoring for hauora Māori outcomes, both in a commissioning or strategic commissioning context, and most importantly to bring the voices of our people right inside the system. Because realistically, Māori will not fill out the complaints or, compliment forms that sit within our systems. They're just not going to do that. So we have to have much more innovative ways, and the ways to bring our voices forward, and we saw this during the COVID pandemic, was like here in Australia, our Indigenous people were the first to respond. They were the first to react. They knew inherently that our kaumātua and our babies would be most at risk, and so we locked ourselves down. It became kind of public fodder and a little bit of cheek at times that we had put up roadblocks, probably, not legally binding, but certainly it was hard to push past a group of people who were standing and blocking the 1-lane bridge that goes into a community. And I had that in my community. But the point here is that we know that when we stood up, we responded not just on behalf of Māori, but on behalf of every person within our community. And that's the context here. If we get things right for those groups who are most disadvantaged by the system, they will inevitably be right for everybody. It is not about making sure that one group gets more privilege than others. I would argue the opposite. I could show you today the statistics which quantify that we are at the bottom or the top of every statistic across the board. And it's not just health, it's education. We too have suffered the uplifting and continue to suffer the uplifting of our children from our families, going out into the communities where they are now no longer in either their natural habitat. Only 25% of our people currently speak Te Reo Māori fluently. We have the lowest education rates and we have the highest incarceration rates. And these are the reasons why we have to get really invigorated about making what I call mokopuna decisions. So on that note, as I said, to look back in the rearview mirror, it can be really disheartening. And the disheartening part is that we see the same repetitive mistakes made over and over again. But courage comes in the form of looking forward. And so I introduce to you a series of photos which outline the true leaders, the true innovators, the true holders of well-being in our communities. There are hundreds of our children being taught through the Pūhoro STEM program in the kuras every day. We have Kura Kaupapa Māori, we have the Kohanga Reo movement, which are our early childhood education centres. We have our MAPAS program, which ensures that our people are looked after, our young students are looked after when they come into health. And I just want to call out Dr. Rhys Jones and Dr. Paparangi Reid, who are also here from my community and are also key leaders, in fact, the leaders in Māori health. I feel like very much a junior and very privileged to be speaking here on behalf of our people. I also want to point out, though, in one of those photos you will see the front line, the true front line, the people who deliver the kai, the people who make sure that all of our facilities are clean and tidy. Don't forget that leadership and well-being is innovated through these people, in the hands of these people as they run every day and speak in the languages of the people who need the services the most. Then, of course, you can see a bunch of people sitting around what looks like a picnic table, but that's outreach at its best. Services cannot be in the infrastructure of buildings, whānau. They don't meet the people who need the service most if we continue to maintain services that are just buildings. We need to make sure that our people get access to services in their community. Increasingly, we have seen this during COVID times, and I believe we'll see it more going forward. Having these big well-being vehicles that go out and address the needs of the people where they live is one way to ensure that they get access to services. And most importantly, it is one way to build the trust within the communities who we have decimated the trust with over these many years. And of course, the last photo is the future. You know, we have got to make sure that our young people are fit and ready to go because it is a hard journey. For many of us who have been fighting the big fight for decades in health to change, to move this juggernaut of a system, and usually the most funded part of the whole system in our countries, it is very hard to move. So you need our young people to come on board to be strong, resilient, and ready for the big move. And then you need to make sure that at every aspect you go back to those communities you serve. The wharenui is pivotal to our people and the way that we have connection, the way that we have a sense of well-being. It is our place where we gather. It is the place where we learn. It is the place where we bury and say goodbye to our loved ones, and it is the place where our children are born. These are the kind of infrastructures we need to see more and more in the health and well-being of our people. I just want to call out that picture of a whole bunch of practitioners up on this side. That's Dr. Rawiri McCree-Jensen, another legend in hauora within our country. And all of those people, Bonnie Matahaere, these are nurse leaders who during the most recent Cyclone Gabrielle, because we couldn't, our communities were literally cut off. These are the people who flew in by plane, then chopper, and stayed for weeks on end servicing communities to make sure services went out to them. It was one of, the most devastating moments for these communities, and they needed people, Māori clinicians who were willing to go in and work with the people while we rebuilt our communities back. The last thing I leave with you all And thank you so much for listening. I know what it's like to be in a conference and you're kind of trying to pick up those gold nuggets, but please may I implore that the gold nugget you pick up is making mukapuna decisions means that we plan for tomorrow, not for today. It means that always we keep that tongikura at the very heart of our systems, which is e kore tēnei whakaoranga e huri ki tua o aku mokopuna. Please make sure your grandchildren inherit a better place than what we have. I roto i tēnā whakaaro, tēnā rā koutou, tēnā rā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you, Rihanna, for that wonderful presentation as well. It strikes me from an Australian perspective, from an Australian Indigenous perspective, how quite often in this country we turn to Aotearoa and look at it as an exemplar of Maori resistance and sovereignty and so on and so forth. What a lot of people, I think, in this country forget is that the challenges of colonisation are still very real in Aotearoa. What opportunity I think arises, obviously, is that Indigenous Australians and Maori people from Aotearoa can work together to share some of these brilliant examples and initiatives of survival and resistance to colonisation and to really better the health of our communities. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful presentation. I'm now delighted to introduce Sir Michael Marmot, who's been Professor of Epidemiology at University College London since 1985 and is Director of the UCL Institute of Health Equity. He's the author of The Health Gap, The Challenge of an Unequal World, and Status Syndrome. Professor Marmot is an advisor to the WHO Director General on Social Determinants of Health in the new WHO Division of Healthier Populations, distinguished visiting professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong, and co-director of the CUHK Institute of Health Equity. He is the recipient of the WHO Global Hero Award, the Harvard Lowndes Professorship, the Prince Mahidol Award for Public Health, and 20 honorary doctorates. Sir Michael Marmot has led research groups That's pretty impressive. Sir Michael Marmot has led research groups on health inequalities for nearly 50 years. He chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, several WHO regional commissions and reviews on tackling health inequality for governments in the United Kingdom. Please welcome Professor Sir Michael Marmot.
Thank you. If you were moved by, the previous two speakers, I've got some bad news. I've got some moderate news, and then I hope, that I'll finish with something a little more positive. Let me start where you nearly started, of a first principle. Our grandchildren will inherit a better world than we do. My first message, the Gallup organization surveys people in different countries and asks, do you think your children will have a better life than you, about the same, or a worse life? Throughout Europe, a minority of today's adults think their children will have a better life than them. In the UK, it's 1/3 think their children will have a better life. And my guess is when they were answering that question, they were not thinking about the climate emergency. If we factor in the climate emergency and ask, will our children have a better life than us? And the answer is, most adults know we've messed it up. We are not delivering a better life for our grandchildren. And we know we can do better. And we're not doing it. So my first message is really grim. My second, I said, was a bit here and there. In March 2020, neoliberalism hit the buffers. That's a bit dramatic. But in the United States, in March, as the pandemic took hold, the stock market fell and the bond market fell. Now, that's not supposed to happen. When stocks go down, bonds go up, and they both fell. I don't want to get into this, but the whole global financial system depends on US Treasury bonds. If US Treasury bonds go down, the whole global financial system is at risk. And the US government knew that. The US Treasury issued trillions of dollars of new debt. Never mind neoliberalism, leave it to the market will deliver. By the end of 2020, the rich countries of the world had issued $18 trillion of new debt. Total GDP in the world is around $80 trillion. Wow, nearly a quarter of GDP in new debt. In the US, half the new debt was bought up by the central bank, the Federal Reserve. Neoliberalism, leave it to the market. Once serious things happen, they don't believe it at all. The government's got to get involved. What happened to middle and low-income countries? Oh, bad luck. You can't do it. You just have to suffer. So global inequity and a clear demonstration that neoliberalism had failed was there for all to see with the pandemic. And we knew it was causing problems. The two countries that are the apostles of that way of doing things, the United States and the United Kingdom, we documented in the UK. I did the so-called Marmot Review in 2010 and made a series of recommendations on how to reduce health inequalities. In 2020, we published Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on, and we looked back at what had happened in the previous decade of austerity. The rate of improvement in life expectancy slowed dramatically. Health inequalities got bigger. If you classify people by where they live, classify where they live by level of deprivation, it's a gradient. The greater the deprivation, the shorter the life expectancy. That gradient got steeper. Literally, on my laptop this morning, we've got updated figures. We're going to send round to members of parliament saying, this is what's going on in your constituency. Things are getting worse. Do you care that health is getting worse? And for the poorest people in the most deprived decile, life expectancy went down, and healthy life expectancy went down, particularly for women. Just think about that. The promise was things will get better for us as well as for our children and grandchildren. And we're not delivering on that promise. Health is getting worse. When giving evidence to a public inquiry, I said that this was linked to austerity. The former Prime Minister, it was giving evidence to the same inquiry, was put to him. Professor Marmot told us your policies, and he said, Marmot's wrong. I see, okay. I've got the evidence. All you've got is ignorant prejudice of the damage you've done to the country. Health getting worse for the poorest people. In Britain, the end of 2023, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report on destitution. Destitution was defined as doing without two or more of housing, heat, light, food, clothing, and toiletries. In Britain, the figures from 2022, published at the end of last year, 1 million children living in a state of destitution, a 2.9-fold increase in 5 years. We've got scurvy and rickets in our hospitals. pandemic made things worse. And then thirdly, a cost of living crisis. And that slowdown in improvement in life expectancy over the decade was worse in the UK than any other rich country except Iceland and the United States. Neoliberalism has not been delivering better health, and it's been increasing inequities in health. It's not really good news to say that it's been found wanting, but what it means is we badly need a new settlement. We badly need to rediscover the common good, public purpose. Life is not only about markets. It's about recognizing the common good. It's about recognizing public purpose. And I think we're starting to get a glimmer of that recognition. My third message, which I hope is a bit more possible, is it is possible to take action. I've talked about Britain, where I sat down with a former minister, and he said, you know, the present government doesn't like you. I said, I kind of knew that, but to hear it put so baldly by an insider is a bit diverting. My second thought was, at least they've noticed. We badly need a new settlement, a different way of doing things. I often get asked, the second most common question I get asked is, why are you not depressed? No one seems to be listening to you. That's why I'm not depressed. They are listening. The English city of Coventry declared itself a marmot city. I had made 6 domains of recommendations: give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4, everyone should have at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. Number 5, healthy and sustainable places in which to live and work. And number 6, taking a social determinants approach to prevention. Subsequently, we've added 2, tackle discrimination, racism, and their outcomes, and pursue health equity and sustainability together in a way that was there all along. So Coventry picked up our 6 and said, we will do this as a city, not the healthcare sector, but the city, the voluntary and community sector, the police, the education, the fire and rescue service. Now we've got business involved. Greater Manchester said, well, if Coventry can do it, we can do it. So Greater Manchester, we did a report for them, Build Back Fairer in Greater Manchester. I went to Liverpool and said, do you know what they're doing in Manchester? So Liverpool now talks about implementing Marmot. We've got 9 areas where we've done reports in England and Wales. Scotland said, maybe we should become a Marmot country. We're about to start work with Scotland. The former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, in Fife, said he would like Fife. It's known as the Kingdom of Fife. He said, forgive me, that I'd like Fife to be the first Marmot kingdom. Well, he's a former Prime Minister. Does that have any relevance globally? Well, I'd like to think so. What we've done with these places, by the way, the acute embarrassment that they're called Marmot places. I did ask Greater Manchester not to do it. Said, too late, it's a brand name. So forget that it's me we're talking about. It's a brand name. We do not go into a place and say, here, we know what you should do it. We go into a place and say, what are your priorities? What do you see as the problems? And when I think about my limited experience in Australia with First Peoples, this has been what I've learned. I was taken, for example, in Tharawal, which called Campbelltown, south of Sydney, to the Tharawal Community Centre. And I had a learning experience. I'd been there twice. It was not what I told them, it's what they told me. We've got evidence of what you can do. What we don't have is lived experience. What we don't have is the priority of communities. And that's important because the journey is important as well as the destination. And the journey means that local people have to be leading this. We have knowledge. We've reviewed the world's evidence. We've got a fair idea of the principles. But we've got to put together that knowledge and those principles with local and community action. And these are not controlled experiments that we've been doing in the UK. But, for example, in Coventry, the proportion of children aged 5 with a good level of development has gone up. The proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds not in employment, education, or training has gone down. The proportion of people in work earning a real living wage has gone up. So I said it, they're not proper controlled experiments, but it's proof of concept that despite what's going on nationally, which has all been in the wrong direction, what we documented from 2010 on, child poverty went up, the spending per pupil on education went down by 8%, and a bigger drop in spending in more deprived areas. What? The government spent less on education and reduced the spending in poorer areas. We don't want poor kids to get educated. What? And then you get a surprise when inequalities are increasing. So we do want national policy to be going in the right direction. But these leaders in local government with whom we work, none of them is saying that there's nothing we can do. I shared a platform with the mayor of Liverpool, and he made a rousing speech about Liverpool going to be a great city, good for everybody, 2 wonderful football teams in Liverpool and Liverpool Women's. That's an in-joke for followers of the English Premier League. But the point being that the leaders in local government saying there's a great deal we can do. We're not wringing our hands and saying it's too difficult. So yes, let me finish with something I learned in Thailand a long time ago at the People's Health Assembly. They talk about the triangle that moves the mountain. The triangle that moves the mountain: the people, the government, and knowledge, academia. Put those together, and I mentioned people first, put those together, and we can move mountains.
Thank you, Professor Marmot, for that wonderfully inspiring presentation, and clearly, pointing out that the politics of what a successful society and a healthy society looks like is actually open to ideological interpretations and so on, and that we need to listen. I was particularly interested or excited to hear you talk about how exactly, how it's important to listen to the communities about what are their priorities rather than just coming in with this kind of blueprint from somewhere else and trying to impose it on others. All right, as I work out my tech again, it's my pleasure to introduce our fourth and final speaker. Professor Helen Evans, AO, is an experienced leader and manager in both complex global health organisations and in the public sector in Australia, with a particular focus on infectious diseases. Since 2005, she has held executive leadership positions in the two most dynamic and impactful public-private partnerships in global health, contributing significantly to the evolution of these organisations and their major contributions to sustainable approaches to health and development. Helen served as Deputy CEO at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, based in Geneva from 2009 until retiring in 2014. Prior to joining Gavi, Helen was Deputy Executive Director at the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria between 2005 and 2009. For the 7 years prior to moving to Geneva, she headed the Australian Government's Office for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health. Helen now lives in Melbourne, where she has an honorary appointment as Professor at the Nossal Institute for Global Health at the University of Melbourne. She serves as Vice Chair of the Board of the Fred Hollows Foundation, as a Director on the Board of the Burnett Institute, and as a Board Member of the Australian Centre for the Prevention of Cervical Cancer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Helen Evans, AO.
Thank you, Tristan. And I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the people of the Kulin Nation, and all Indigenous people in Australia. And I pay my respects to their knowledge and practices and to their elders past and present. When I was asked to be the last speaker, it was suggested that I tie together some of the threads of the session and then reflect on what we as the global health community can learn and how we should respond. Both Marcia and Rihanna come from deep lived experience, both professionally and personally, of the enormous strengths and wisdoms of their communities, passed down through the ages, and their extraordinary resilience in the face of continuing dispossession and discrimination. Marcia presented a very stark, but I'm ashamed to say accurate picture of the power imbalance from the beginning of colonisation in Australia that continues today, and the continuing urgent need to redress it. And I think with Rihanna, we heard also of the richness and the strength of cultural experiences. I think your singing in the opening was just so moving. So thank you. Michael comes from the perspective, initially as a GP, I understand it. No, not as a GP? I must have misread your CV. But certainly a recognition that treating people's presenting medical condition and then sending them back to the same situation that made them sick is a social injustice. And his voluminous work, which I imagine many of you are familiar with over the years on the social determinants of health, that income, education, conditions of employment, power and social support act to strengthen or to undermine health of individuals and communities. And as we heard eloquently presented today, he focuses on the use of data and statistics to highlight health inequalities. I tend to think of myself, or like to think of myself, as a pragmatic optimist, but I think, Michael, you really take the award for that in keeping positive, even though the messages are pretty grim sometimes. But the key message that comes through from the three previous speakers is that it's not just people's material conditions, although these are absolutely key, and Marcia presented some of the terrible statistics, but it's actually also their social circumstances which have a sustained impact on health and well-being. And while resources and technical skills are essential, they're not sufficient on their own. It's the quality of people's lives and their relationships that's significantly determined by how much agency they have and how much control they have over their lives and the lives of their communities. Michael's talked in articles I've read about you, Michael, I hope this one's accurate. Talks about dignity being all important to health and to thriving sustainable communities. And in the same vein, Marcia and Rihanna talked about the ongoing impact of colonisation that has entrenched systems of racism, patriarchy and economic extraction nationally and globally. That when communities and groups of people are stripped of their dignity and agency and their knowledge and cultural ways of doing things and their abilities are ignored and dismissed, individuals and communities really struggle and fragment, and their health certainly is impacted. So what then are the implications for those of us who work in health and development? And I have to confess that I really grappled with how best to address this rather daunting task, because there's really no singular understanding of what constitutes a healthy society and made up of thriving communities. It will really vary by culture, politics and history, although there are a lot of common threads. So the biggest question I had to face was, what would I attempt to do in 15 minutes to explore? Would I attempt to explore conceptually the central themes and implications of decolonisation and localisation, which all of us, any of us working in global health, really need to address? Or should I look at the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration to address increasing inequities within countries, between countries, and intergenerational? And I think, Rihanna, you made that point really strongly about the next generation. Or should I keep it more practical and talk about the lessons and challenges from my experience of what supports thriving communities and provides the foundations for health and wellbeing? I decided actually I'd take the latter with a bit of the former thrown in. And I come from a very different experience from the three previous speakers, but one in which I think the key learnings and actions mesh with my fellow panellists. And indeed, there were many recurring themes from yesterday's session. I speak as someone with experience and expertise in public health and development, but as a manager and a funder of both national and global programs. I'm also acutely aware that my lived experience has been as a white person from a high-income country, and no matter how open to listening or learning I might want to be or think I am, I can't ignore or deny my own mindset and the power imbalance between me and my role as a funder and that of the communities, non-government organisations and implementing country governments that I worked with. So, adding to what Marcia, Rihanna and Michael have said, I want to talk briefly about what I learned as a non-Indigenous person managing the national program in Australia that funded the Aboriginal community-controlled medical services and their wellbeing services. I have to say that I learned so many invaluable lessons that I took with me and which shaped my approach when I moved to work globally in health and development. So I'm just going to tell you some of the things I learned. I learned that different communities and different cultures have different ways of discussing issues and reaching and describing a way forward that weren't necessarily clear to me, nor would they be the way I would do it, but were perfectly valid and effective. They were built on years of accepted community and cultural practice, and it was therefore essential that I respect that and that I sit quietly and listen and try to hear and learn what they were saying. I learned that collaboration and working in partnership had to be founded on respect and working as equals, which is vastly different to token consultation. At the same time, I acknowledged that it would be naive or disingenuous not to recognise that I was ultimately the holder of the purse. I learned also that it's essential to go out to communities and spend time in their space to understand their issues and their priorities. If you meet people in your office in Canberra, as I could do, with its foreignness and its trappings of power imbalance, it's not the way to work in partnership. And really learn what's important to that community. I learnt that the Aboriginal community-controlled health services here that we have in Australia have an integrated model of primary health care that exemplifies the principles of Alma Ata, although they commenced before Alma Ata, as Naomi Myers would have me say. And the broader health system in Australia could learn a lot from looking at this model, not only the service integration, but also the governance principles and practices. I learnt that it was essential to be flexible with processes and procedures to respond to communities' priorities and their ways of doing things, to try and strip back as much as possible the endless processes and applications, documenting, reporting, etc. While at the same time, I also needed to balance the need to be accountable for the funds. But as a fund holder, you also need to be prepared to take risks. I learnt that trust and genuine respect is earned, it's not ascribed, and it also takes time. And that even if a relationship of trust has been established, you are not of that community and never assume that that's the case. So now I want to talk briefly about how that experience was fundamental in guiding me when I went to work in Geneva at the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria in its early formative years. It was at that time a very different way of doing development, as its founding executive director, Richard Feacham, used to say. And in many ways, it attempted to encapsulate the principles of what we're now calling localisation, or I think I'd rather prefer the term locally led. The fundamental principle for the Global Fund was that country-driven and country-owned, with country, means not only governments, but also civil society. That there had to be two principal recipients, a government recipient and a non-government recipient. The governance structure was to put all the relevant parties around the board table: country governments, donor governments, civil society, both north and south, private sector and philanthropic foundations, and voting was structured to give equal power to what was called the Southern Bloc of implementing countries and civil society. And this was the first time that civil society organisations had been given an equal place at a global health institution board table, and it was probably the first time that donors didn't dominate in the decision-making, which was a bit of a challenge for them sometimes. A similar oversight arrangement was established at the country level. It was a bold initiative, and perhaps the most exciting aspect was the support for civil society, community-based organisations and affected communities. It gave them agency. It recognised and respected the fact that they were the people who knew what was needed and what would make a difference, and supported them to advocate on their own behalf. I might add that this was not always so positively received by some of their national governments. So if I look at that organisation 20 years on, and I have had that opportunity because for the last 8 years, up until the end of last year, I was on its independent evaluation committee. I do think it was a bold and positive step forward and has enabled and continues to enable very significant positive impact on the lives of many people in low and low middle income countries. However, there's always a however, times have changed. The power imbalance is still there, despite efforts in both its governance structure and strategic and political intent to shift this. It's still an organisation with its headquarters based in the north, with its processes, procedures and reporting shaped by donor requirements and written in the language of high-income countries. As Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, said in a recent interview, it is still essentially, although not entirely, charity funding from high-income countries and philanthropists. And that it, along with some other global institutions, really needs a bit of a rethink, and I think it's time for that. Of relevance to our discussion today, perhaps the most significant and repeated finding from evaluations has been that the Global Fund had difficulty in actually funding and supporting community groups despite its intention and its outline in at least its last two strategies. So I'll give you an example for an evaluation I was involved in that reported in June 2022 on the engagement of civil society and communities. And it concluded that at the strategic and the secretariat level, firstly, there was a lack of a shared understanding of community contributions to the mission of the fund. Secondly, that community contributions were consistently under-recognised. And thirdly, that risks and processes trump communities and complexities. And I think that last conclusion really encapsulates a very core roadblock to changing the way we do things. So what are the key messages for global health practitioners? I've got a number of them. Indigenous communities, not only in Australia, have experience, knowledge and models developed over centuries that work and must be respected and supported. But more than that, there's so much to be learnt from them. And this similarly applies to communities and civil society organisations globally. Too often the assumption or the paradigm is that knowledge flows one way down into communities with no recognition or respect for the knowledge and wisdom that resides in the communities and an understanding that learning goes both ways. Also that words matter. We use terms like empowerment, consultation, capacity building, skills transfer, which in many ways reinforce the assumption of a one-way flow. Words such as engagement, collaboration, partnering, co-creation, knowledge sharing do send different messages. We only have to look at how many communities and their networks responded during COVID when countries were locked down internally and between countries, and Marcia talked about the very strong response, and I think Rihanna did too, of Indigenous communities in this respect. Or if we look at what's happening in Myanmar due to civil conflict, or indeed in Australia during our terrible 2019-2020 devastating fires, to see both the central importance and the strength of local communities. So equity and social justice really matter. It's not just woke, to use a favourite phrase of our right-wing commentators and politicians, or even a nice thing to have once we've looked after ourselves. Rising inequality fuels alienation, the fragmentation of the society, which is to the detriment of all of us. Failure to address the social determinants of health and economic inequality drive further health inequalities, but they also fuel mistrust and reduce social cohesion. Why would people feel any need to act in the common good when society does nothing for them or doesn't seem to care about them? For governments and policymakers, funders and managers, there's an urgent need for a much greater focus on what will make a difference, what will make a sustainable impact on people's lives, rather than focusing primarily on accountability for funds. And I don't underestimate that, having been a donor, but the primary focus on accountability for funds and consequently lengthy processes and procedures which drown and exclude local communities. As I said, I think this was well captured in the conclusion of the evaluation I referred to, where it said risk and processes trump communities and complexities. If we're really committed to focusing on creating thriving, sustainable communities, then government organisations, funding organisations and their donor institutions must be prepared to loosen up on their rigid processes and procedures and allow their staff more discretion to do this and support local communities, express priorities and established ways of doing business. As Dr. Pukala said yesterday, authentic partnerships involve co-creation and them being ready to step away when the time is right. Adriana said, yes, it involves giving up. Everybody gives up a bit. And yes, it will involve more risk. I guess I'd be less than honest. I'm going to finish up, Tristan. I know we're probably running out of time. I'd be less than honest if I didn't say that the headwinds in 2024 against adopting these approaches are quite strong. Many speakers yesterday referred to the multiple crises we're facing in 2024 that all interact and collide. Climate change with increasing natural disasters, increasing inequality between and within countries and intergeneration, fueling alienation and fragmentation of society, major conflict in multiple countries resulting in massive movement of people who have no home, significant national debt across all countries as a result of the COVID pandemic, which is certainly leading to high-income countries reducing their support for countries beyond their borders. Misinformation and conspiracy theories fueled by social media fanning fragmentation within and between countries and communities. The rise of populism, including white supremacy movements and right-wing inward-focusing governments. However, and to be a positive pragmatist, crises can be catalysts for change, but if we want that change to be sustainable, we need to be prepared to step outside our business-as-usual mindset. We have to look beyond risk and debt and processes to what's the impact of supporting communities, and indeed the counterfactual of not doing this. Because the very headwinds listed above, the importance of thriving and healthy communities is greater than it's ever been before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that wonderful presentation and for bringing together the three individual perspectives of our previous speakers. You've done part of my job for me, so that's wonderful. But adding your own as well and really kind of demonstrating the crucial or critical need for us to have all voices at the table here. It strikes me that, Professor Langton, you mentioned briefly before we came up on stage that some of the messages that you're sharing today and that all of us are sharing today have been shared before. The Indigenous voices have been expressed through, not just through art and culture, and you pointed out the piece that won the Vienna Biennial that I think we've got a chance to play in a moment. But through political lobbying, through academic papers, through research, through activism, through all sorts of conversations, and we quite often continue this conversation where we talk about how we have to listen to Indigenous voices and we have to listen to the voices of people from marginalised communities. But people from marginalised communities are saying, we've told you this before. We're continuing to tell you this. The message is there. And so I think at a venue like this, at a summit like this, it's really worthwhile noting that, I think, Professor Marmot, you're talking about how people really need to start acting on some of these things and listening, and you were buoyed by the idea that you were being listened to when you were consulting with these communities that needed something positive. So I think it's all incumbent upon all of us to think about how we actually listen to the voices of those who are impacted most significantly by things like climate change, by political decision making, by budgetary constraints and risk management and stuff that overlooks the lived experience of these communities. So I'd love to thank our panellists one more time, please, before I want to get a thumbs up. Please thank the rest of our panellists. And I have got a thumbs up there in the shadows saying we do have the video that Professor Langton, you wanted to share earlier, and I think that would be a wonderful way to finish this session.
Oh, that's wonderful, but only play, say, 1 minute and 5 seconds. 1 minute and 5 seconds.
Foreigners everywhere is the overall theme of the 60th Venice Biennale. And coincidentally, it's Australia's pavilion that really tests that proposition, with an expansive family tree, documenting 2,500 generations and capturing the ancestors of all humankind. It's the work of Archie Moore, the Gamilaroi and Biggamble artist, and it's called Kith and Kin.
Kith and kin means, in the familiar sense, friends and family, but I was interested in an earlier English definition of kith, which meant countrymen or of one's own land. So I thought that was more of a Indigenous understanding that English people had and connection to the land.
The tree includes all Archie's known relatives from northwestern New South Wales and southwestern Queensland. That's Gamilaroi and Biggamble country. But unlike the Biennale, the borders are rendered invisible.
So the tree starts with my family and goes back 65,000 years and beyond. It's the accepted amount of time Indigenous people lived on the continent of Australia. But it also includes every person on the planet, as we all have a common ancestor with Indigenous kinship systems that not only include other human beings but every living thing on the land, talking about that interconnectedness between us and the environment, which is very important for Indigenous people.
So that central platform, tell us about that.
In the middle of the pavilion there's over 500 documents floating above a pool of water, and most of those documents are coroner's reports into Aboriginal deaths in custody from 1991 to 2023. Amongst that is 19 documents from the archives that feature my family. Some of those people are in the tree and you can see their names. And there's also blank reams of paper representing the gaps in the record. They're reports that we know exist, but we had no access to them. They weren't publicly available. The names on the coroner reports are also redacted out of respect for the people who have passed away.
I think it's absolutely amazing, and the sensitivity with which it has been conceived and realized.
We've got a mic. Thank you. I need to get my sound tech signalling skills honed in, I think, for the next time. But thank you so much for doing that. Please join me again in thanking our very distinguished panel in Marcia Langton, Rihanna Manuel, Michael Marmot and Helen Evans. Thank you.